So now let's start with the very important aspect of the epidemiology, right? But before that, let me just describe the epidemiology further. Okay, so epidemiology is having the types. Okay, so the basis of epidemiology, I have just talked about that in the previous chapter. Please go through that first of all and then come to this particular chapter, right? So in this particular chapter, I will be talking about a very important type of epidemiology, right? So first of all, let me just talk about how will we approach this epidemiology. So epidemiology further, okay, epidemiology further, we are talking about two important types over here, right? One is the observational study of the epidemiology and another one is the experimental study of the epidemiology. So one is the observational study of epidemiology and another one is the experimental study of epidemiology, right? Experimental study of epidemiology, right? This chapter will be very interesting, guys, so stay tuned with this one. So observational study, if you talk about here, we are not doing any intervention, right? We are not doing any intervention, okay, but in the experimental study we are doing the intervention. In the observation study we are having that approach that let the nature do its thing, okay, we will just observe it, right? Let the nature do the things, we will just observe it, right? In the experimental we will be observing and then if we will feel to intervene, then we will be having the intervention also, right? That is the experimental. That's why the name suggests experiment. We are experimenting with something, right? Observation means we are just relaxing back and observing. Let the nature do the thing, we will just observe. So in the observation study, we are not doing any kind of intervention, right? So this is the non-interventional. This is the non-interventional study, right? While experimental study is the interventional study. Experimental study is the interventional study. Okay. Then next point over here is in the observation study you can divide it further, right? The observation study can be divided further and we shall talk about the descriptive epidemiology and the analytical epidemiology, right? So I mean the descriptive studies can be done in this particular observational study section and the analytical studies. So descriptive studies can be done or analytical studies can be done. Analytical studies can be done, right? Now, these studies should be actually talked about thoroughly, okay? What studies? Observational study and the experimental study. Observational study has further two types. One is the descriptive one and another one is the analytical one. And experimental study will be the separate topic. So in this today's session, I'm going to talk about the descriptive studies, or you might say it as descriptive epidemiology, right guys? In the next chapter, I will be talking about the analytical epidemiology or analytical studies of epidemiology, right? So let's start with the descriptive studies of epidemiology or rather descriptive epidemiology, okay? Fine. So let's begin with the very interesting epidemiology, that is the descriptive epidemiology. Descriptive epidemiology, okay? Now in the descriptive epidemiology we are talking about, okay, we are talking about a population, okay, we are talking about a population basically. So first of all, in the descriptive epidemiology, let me say it is basically used to describe a disease of unknown etiology, right? It is used to describe disease of unknown etiology. For an example, we are having some disease, let's say we are having some rare disease, okay, we don't know the cause of it, but we are doing now some study to find out the cause of this particular disease, right? For example, there is disease X, let's say there is disease X, I don't know the cause about it, right? I don't know the cause, that which particular thing is causing this disease X. So I will try to find the cause of this particular disease. Whatever study I will do to find the cause of this particular disease or to find the etiology of this particular disease, that study will be called as the descriptive studies. Understood? Okay, next point. I will be talking about the population in this particular case, right? So in the descriptive studies, what we are doing, we are studying the population. We are studying the disease in this population, right? And we are describing the disease at a time, place and person, right? So what we are doing basically, these are all MCQs, right? So it basically defines the population. It basically defines the population to be studied. Population to be studied basically, right? It defines the disease to be studied. Defines the disease to be studied. Disease to be studied, and it describes the disease at a time, place and person, right? Describes the disease, okay, by time, place, person, right? By time, place and person, okay? These are your keywords for the descriptive epidemiology. If they are using these kind of keywords in the MCQ, then probably they are talking about which kind of epidemiology, that is the descriptive epidemiology, right? Here in the descriptive epidemiology, we are formulating the hypothesis. We are making the hypothesis, right? So formulation of hypothesis is done in this particular studies. Formulation of hypothesis, right? Because there are many diseases, right? There are many diseases of which we can say the pathogenesis is not known properly, right? The exact pathogenesis we don't know, right? There are many diseases which you might have studied in medicine part, right? And usually what we are left with the hypothesis, okay? This particular scientist is having his own hypothesis, that particular scientist is having his own hypothesis about the disease, right? So the formulation of the hypothesis, it means which kind of study? Descriptive epidemiology or descriptive study. So formulation of hypothesis is done in that case, okay? Once they ask you this question, what is hypothesis? Very simple question. Hypothesis, formulation of hypothesis is done in this particular descriptive studies. Once they ask you what is hypothesis? Hypothesis basically some variable which has to be tested. Okay, so hypothesis basically it is a variable to be tested. Variable to be tested actually, that is the hypothesis, right? So this was once they ask you this MCQs, right? However, all the points are your MCQs only. Okay, next point over here. This is the measurement of disease by cross-sectional studies or the longitudinal study. Okay, in the next section in the analytical epidemiology, I will be talking about the case control study, cross-sectional study, cohort study, right? Very famous one. So these kind of studies, I will be talking about them in the analytical epidemiology, right? But for now, just remember that here we are actually doing the measurement of disease by what? By cross-sectional study. Why is it so? Because in the cross-sectional study, I will be talking about that we are studying the population. Here also I am studying the population. That's why it is the measurement of disease by cross-sectional or longitudinal studies. Okay, longitudinal study. Fine. Okay. Here actually we are actually comparing with the non-indices. Okay. We are having some data and we are comparing that. So comparing with non-indices. Okay, these are all your MCQs. Comparing with non-indices. Fine. So that is about your descriptive epidemiology. Here we are talking about the trends. What are the trends? We are talking about the time trends basically. Okay, or time fluctuations, right? So what are these time fluctuations I am talking about? So very, very, very important, very high yield for the MCQs purpose. That is time trends, not time machine, time trends, right? Time trends or time fluctuation. Okay, fine. So guys, time trends. Here we are having three important types, very, very important types. What are these three types of trends? These are, one is the short-term trend. Okay. First one is the short-term trends or short-term fluctuations. Short-term fluctuations or short-term trends. Okay. Second one is the periodic fluctuation. Second one is the periodic fluctuation or periodic trend, you might say that. Okay. And third one is the long-term fluctuations. Long-term fluctuation or long-term trends. Okay. In the periodic fluctuation, we are having further two types. In the periodic one, we are having further two types. One is the cyclical trend and another one is the seasonal trend. Okay. One is the cyclical trend and another one is the seasonal trend. Don't worry, we will talk about them in detail, right? For now, I just gave you the idea. There are three types of time trends in the descriptive epidemiology: short-term trend, periodic trend, and the long-term trend. In the periodic trend, we are talking about two types, cyclical trend and the seasonal trend. Okay, now let's move on to, first of all, short-term fluctuation or short-term trend. Okay, we'll talk about every particular type. So now I'm just starting with the very first one, that is your short-term trend. Okay, short-term trends or short-term fluctuations, right? So just writing that short-term trends. Okay, in the short-term trends, we are talking about outbreak or epidemic, right? So this is also known as aka also known as basically outbreak or epidemic. Okay, outbreak or epidemic. Fine. So outbreak, it is actually happening in the smaller areas. Okay, if I'm talking about the smaller areas, I will talk about the outbreak. Okay, if I'm talking about smaller areas, I will talk about outbreak. If I'm talking about larger area, I will talk about the epidemic. Simple, right? So epidemic, basically I will say that it is a sudden rise. Okay, sudden rise in number of cases, sudden rise in number of cases which is beyond your expectations, right? Which is beyond your expectation, more than 80% of your expectation, right? More than 80% expectation, right? That is the epidemic. Outbreak in the smaller area, epidemic usually in the larger area. So what is the short-term trend? In a short period of time, sharp rise in number of cases is basically seen in the short-term trend. Okay, so basically we are talking about the types over here, right? We are talking about the types over here. What are the types we shall talk about in the short-term trends? If you talk about the types in the short-term trends, very first one would be, okay, I will just name it as A. Name it as A. That is the common source, right? Common source, or it is also called as the point source. Common source or point source epidemics. Common source or point source epidemics, right? In the common source or point source epidemics, we are talking about the types once again, guys. And these types are, first one is the single exposure point source epidemic. That is the SEPS, SEPS. SEPS is your single exposure point source epidemic, right? Point source epidemic. And the next type over here is the multiple exposure point source epidemic. Okay, multiple exposure point source epidemics. Okay, and the second type over here, okay, A was common source or point source epidemic, B is your propagated or progressive epidemic. Propagated or progressive epidemics. Okay, fine. Now we shall talk about these types in detail. Okay, so guys, we are having time trends in the descriptive epidemiology, that is short-term trend, periodic trend, long-term trends. In the periodic trends, there are cyclical trends and the seasonal trends. Okay, let's talk about, first of all, that is short-term trends. In the short-term trends of fluctuation, we are talking about the outbreaks or epidemics. Epidemics, if we talk about, there are types. One is the common source, that is your point source epidemics. Another one is the propagated source or the progressive epidemic. In the short term, or I would say in the common source or the point source epidemic, we are having two types. That is, one is single exposure point source and one is the multiple exposure point source epidemic. Okay, so now let's talk about the single exposure point source epidemic. Okay, so I'm just describing the first one, that is a single exposure point source epidemic. Single exposure point source, right, epidemics. Okay, so now let's talk about that. In the single exposure point source epidemic, what are the important salient points which are actually very frequently tested in your MCQs as well? First one, that is all the cases which you will be seeing in that particular phase will be actually seen in the one incubation period only. Okay, seen in one incubation period only after a single exposure, right? So basically all the cases are seen in one incubation period only, one incubation period only. Okay, second point over here is that average incubation period, if you talk about, that will be corresponding to the median incubation period. Okay, so average incubation period, okay, corresponds to median incubation period, corresponds to, right, median incubation period. Very, very important. Okay, and this was your MCQs as well. So median incubation period, what do you mean by that? This is the incubation period, okay, which is the single incubation period seen in the short single exposure point source epidemic, right? Now next point over here, which is very important, which is actually we are seeing the sharp rise in the number of cases. Okay, sharp rise in the number of cases followed by fall in the number of cases. So sharp rise, not the gradual, but the sharp rise in number of cases, okay, followed by fall in the number of cases. Okay, now one more very important point, that is only one wave is seen over here, that is the primary wave. Only one wave is seen over here, and that is the primary wave. I will justify each and every point over here which I am writing right now. Okay, just give me some time over here. Then return of cases will be actually around one incubation period only. So the return of cases also, return of cases will be around one incubation period only, will be around one incubation period, one incubation period only. Okay, now let's look at this graph. Here on one side I might write number of cases, okay, another side I might write actually date of exposure, fine. Now the graph which I am talking about over here is like this. Okay, so what I can write over here, there is sharp rise in the number of cases, right? What I shall see over here, there is sharp rise in the number of cases and sharp fall in the number of cases. Okay, for example, the best example could be the food poisoning, right? Best example could be the food poisoning. Okay, many number of people went to the marriage party. Okay, they ate the contaminated food over there, had the food poisoning due to that. This is what? This is an example of single exposure, means at a single time. Okay, due to that, all of them, okay, almost all of them developed the food poisoning. It means due to the contaminated food, it means single exposure point source epidemic. It means sharp rise in the number of cases and due to followed by sharp fall in the number of cases. This is the single exposure point source epidemic. Okay, so here what is the incubation period? Only one incubation period. How many waves you can see? Only one primary wave I can see, right? So this became the example of, okay, yes, so this became the example of your single exposure point source epidemic, right? Now I am coming to the next one, that is the multiple exposure point source epidemic. Okay, so let's talk about the next one now, that is a multiple exposure point source epidemic, second one. Okay, multiple exposure point source epidemic. In the multiple exposure point source epidemic, first of all, let me draw the graph only so that you don't have any confusion. So graph is like this, where there is a rise in number of cases, but after that there are many waves, there are many secondary waves also. Okay, so how you can actually compare this graph with the single exposure point source epidemic? Hey, there it was only one primary wave. There it was only one wave, that's why we call that as primary wave only. How many incubation period was there? Only one incubation period. Here in the multiple exposure point source, you can see multiple exposure periods, okay, multiple incubation periods, right? So that is the thing basically over here. Okay, next point is, what about the example? I will come to the example. First of all, let me just document some of the important point over here. Okay, first point over here is that in the multiple exposure point source epidemic, okay, the multiple exposure from the point source will be seen. Multiple exposure from point source. Exposure from point source will be seen. For an example, a milkman is there. Milkman went to one home, then another home, then another home, then another home, like that. Okay, so milkman will be actually moving in one society, and he will be actually distributing the milk everywhere. Now let's say his milk was not of the good quality. That milk was actually contaminated due to some infection over there. Okay, so what happened after that? Whatever milk he's actually providing to the different houses in the society, okay, they will be getting infected. At one time he will be going to some different society, okay, next day he will be going to some different society, next day he will be going to some different society, right? Like that it will happen. So in that case, in different version of time, or I would say in the different periods of time, okay, different persons will be getting infected. So here you will be seeing that one person will be infected, then they will be having the recovery, then some other person will be having infection, then they will be getting recovery, then some other person will be having infection, they will be getting recovery. So multiple waves will be seen in this pattern. So that's why there will be one primary wave where there is a rise in number of cases, and then there will be the secondary waves also in the multiple exposure, because the multiple exposures are coming from the point source. While in the single exposure, I told you, number of people, they gathered around in some party or some function, had some contaminated food, and almost all of them got the food poisoning, for an example. So that is the example of single exposure. Here the multiple exposures are coming from a point source, that's why that is a multiple exposure point source. So primary and secondary waves will also be seen over there. Okay, incubation period, is it one or more than one? Obviously there will be more than one incubation period. So here what we can see, the cases which are occurring, cases occur with more than one incubation period, more than one incubation period. Okay, next point over here, what we can say, that is over here, will the secondary waves will be seen? Yes, secondary waves will be seen. So secondary waves are seen over here. In the single exposure there was only primary wave, so secondary waves are seen. Secondary waves are seen over here. Okay, next point over here is the rise in number of cases will be there, but there will be no fall. In the single exposure, I told you rise in number of cases was there, but followed by fall was also there. In the multiple exposure, you are not seeing the fall. You are not seeing the fall over here. So that's why I can write that rise in number of cases without fall in number of cases. Okay, secondary waves are seen, more than one incubation period is seen. These are all your MCQs. Okay, so only just one diagram, only just one graph, if you will remember, that will serve the purpose of MCQs. Okay, very important, and I hope I could make this interesting as well to understand. Okay, so there is no need to mug up all the things in what is happening in the single exposure, what is happening in the multiple exposure. If you find this concept in your mind, okay, very easy to understand, very easy to remember. Okay, now next one, what could be the example of this case in the secondary wave? For example, cholera outbreak. Okay, what could be the example? Example could be, let's say the cholera outbreak. Okay, cholera outbreak over here. Okay, that is the thing. Or milkman example I told you. Okay, how the milkman is actually going to home and home, and at a different time different persons are getting infected. Okay, the contaminated well example you can take. The different number of persons at a different time, they are actually getting the water from the contaminated well, drinking it, and at different time, okay, at a different time actually they are actually getting the infection, they are getting contaminated. Okay, so contaminated well example you can take, or milkman example you can take. Right, just writing that. I hope you were able to understand that. Okay, fine. Now moving on to the next one. Okay, so we have talked about the common source or the point source epidemic. We have talked about the common source or the point source epidemic, guys, in which we have talked about the single exposure point source epidemic, we have talked about the multiple exposure point source epidemic, and I have talked about the examples as well. Now I'm just moving on to the next one, that is the propagated or progressive epidemic. Propagated or progressive epidemic. Okay, so yes, that is the propagated epidemic or progressive epidemic. Okay, I hope you guys are with me, guys, and enjoying with me as well. So propagated epidemics. In the propagated epidemics, basically we are saying that there is an abrupt rise in number of cases again, but exponential increase will be seen. So here we are talking about abrupt rise in number of cases. Abrupt rise in number of cases. If I will say just one example, the whole picture in your mind will be crystal clear about the propagated epidemic and you will never forget. Just one word if I will say, you will understand the propagated epidemic. That is, what is that one word? What is that one example? COVID-19 infection. That's it. If you will think about COVID-19 infection, how the number of cases were increasing actually, that was beyond our expectations, right? So there was exponential increase in the number of cases in the COVID-19 era, which we have talked about, which we have actually, seen in the first case, right? And then in the second case also, the second wave also, the number of cases were increasing exponentially, right? But especially in the first wave, we have seen that how the number of cases were actually increasing exponentially, right? So that's why I said only just one example will serve the purpose of this particular topic, that is propagated epidemic. That in the propagated epidemic, abrupt rise in number of cases will be seen, and I will say that exponential increase will be seen. So example, I don't need to repeat, that is your COVID-19 infection, right? Okay, then here the cases will be occurring, cases occur again with more than one incubation period. With more than one incubation period. These are MCQs, okay? That's why I'm just mentioning that, okay? So that if in case if you are making your notes, okay, it should be there with you. Then third point over here, secondary waves, will it be seen? Yes, secondary waves will be seen. Here also secondary waves you will be seeing. Secondary waves are seen, okay? Then you will say that, is it that decline in cases will be seen over there? Decline in cases you will not see, okay? So like that in single exposure point source, we have talked about decline in cases are seen. Multiple exposure, there was no decline in cases. Here also in the propagated epidemic, there is no decline in cases, okay? So decline in cases we are not seeing. So decline in cases, how we can get that? Decline in cases, how we can achieve that? So decline in cases can be achieved by, in COVID-19, what we were talking about, mass vaccination, right? So vaccinate the persons as much as you can. So mass vaccination, for example, herd immunity, right? Herd immunity, or decrease the density of population, decrease the density of population. Decrease the density of population. Got it? Right? So that is the idea of decrease in the number of cases. How you can achieve that in the COVID-19 infection? We saw that either you talk about the herd immunity, either if the persons will be actually immune to the virus, either the person will be having vaccination. So we have talked about the vaccines also, very famous vaccines, very popular vaccines, for example, Covaxin or the Covishield, right? So, recently many persons got the booster dose of the COVID-19 vaccine as well, right? So that is the idea, right? So that is about the propagated epidemic. Okay, so example, yes, you know that very well, that is the COVID infection, right? COVID-19 infection. Okay, so that would be the example. So what about the graph, guys, over here? So look, okay, here the graph will be looking like this, exponential increase, and will keep on increasing like this. Okay, so there is an exponential rise in the number of cases, right? So which we have actually seen in the COVID-19 infection. Okay, now I'm just moving on to the next one, that is so we have talked about what? Short-term trends. We were talking about trends, so we have talked about short-term trends. Now I will be moving on to the periodic trends. Okay, in the periodic trends, I told you there will be two types. One is the cyclic type and another one is the seasonal type. Okay, so let's talk about the periodic trends now. Okay, so second one. Okay, so I will write B over here. They are the periodic trends. Periodic trends or periodic fluctuations also, you can write that as periodic fluctuations as well, periodic trends. So over here what we can see is types. I told you already, one is the cyclical and another one is the, so types I told you already, one is the cyclical, okay, and another one is the seasonal trend, right? So in the cyclical one, what we can see actually in the cyclical one, so I'm starting with the first one, that is cyclical trend, okay. So here we'll be seeing that the events are occurring in cycles, any kind of disease which is occurring in cycle, right? For example, the disease which is occurring after every 2 to 3 years, after every 5 to 6 years. Okay, some kind of disease are actually occurring after every 5 to 6 years. Okay, for example, influenza occurring after every 7 to 9 years. Okay, before the vaccination time, pre-vaccination phase. Okay, rubella occurring after every 5 to 7 years. Measles occurring after every 2 to 3 years in the pre-vaccination era, I mean. So these are the cyclical trends. Okay, after some period of time, if some disease is actually happening or circulating in a community or a population, right, that is the cyclical trend basically. So it occurs in cycles, I mean, it occurs in cycles, right? Second important point over here is that the disease which is actually occurring in cycles, they will be spreading over a short period of time. Okay, that is actually shown by this trend, right? Next point, example, if I'll talk about, that is like these examples, even they have been asked in your MCQs as well. For example, they have asked you once that measles is actually occurring in how many years actually? After every dash years. So that will be every 2 to 3 years. So measles occurring every 2 to 3 years. Okay, in pre-vaccination phase. Then your rubella, you might take the example of rubella, which is occurring after every 5 to 6 years. Okay, or I would say 5 to 6 years or 5 to 7 years. Influenza, you might take the influenza example as well, occurring every 8 to 10 years or 7 to 10 years in the pre-vaccination phase, right? So these are some of the examples of the cyclical trend. Then if you talk about the seasonal trend, okay, very easy to understand. I hope you understood also. It happens according to seasons. Okay, it happens according to seasons basically. For example, what season I shall talk about over here? For an example, in the monsoon seasons, okay, some particular disease is happening. In the spring season, some particular disease is happening. In the winter season, some particular disease is happening. Okay, so like that, according to the seasons, if the diseases are coming in the community or the population, that is actually tells by the seasonal kind of trend, right? That is actually explained by the seasonal trend. So basically here we are talking about, here in the seasonal trend, we are talking about the occurrence of a disease, in the seasonal variations, which are influenced by, right, which are influenced by some environmental conditions, like summer, winter, okay, all these climate changes, summer, winter, spring, etc. Okay, now here if you talk about the examples, guys, very simple examples. For example, in the monsoon season, there are very high likely chances of the slipping, right? Because the roads are becoming slippery and all. So many road traffic accidents are coming because the two-wheeled vehicles actually, they might slip off on the roads, and due to that accidents might happen. So road traffic accidents are actually coming very frequently in the hospitals, especially in the monsoon seasons, right? So in the monsoon seasons, road traffic accidents might come to your hospital, right? So road traffic accidents. For example, in the winter seasons, you might see the respiratory infections are actually coming basically very frequently, respiratory infections for an example, right? In the like in this time particularly, basically between the July to November, okay, dengue fever cases are very much increasing basically. So in the hospitals, even in my hospital where I was working, basically many dengue cases were coming, right? So many dengue cases are coming basically in the month of around July to November, okay, and right now we are in that phase. So dengue fever, for example, in July to November. Okay, so these are the important example. In the summer, for example, you might take the example of heat stroke, right? Heat stroke or acute gastroenteritis. Okay, these kind of problems can be seen over there. Okay, bacterial gastroenteritis, acute gastroenteritis. So these are the examples which can be seen according to the seasonal variations. So this is actually explained under the seasonal trends. Okay, now I hope you're clear with that. Now I'm moving on to the long-term trends. So we have talked about what? We have talked about the short-term trends. We have talked about the periodic trends, in which we have talked about the seasonal trends and the cyclical trends. Now I'm moving on to the long-term trends. Okay, fine. If you talk about the long-term trends, yes. So if you talk about, see, that is long-term trends. Okay. In the long-term trends, we are talking about the secular trend. Basically, it is also known as your secular trend. Right? It is also known as your secular. Fine. So what is secular trend? Basically, it is seen over many years. Look, for an example, it is talking about decades. Over many years, I mean decades. Okay. For an example, some particular disease is actually increasing in some population. For example, the incidences of CKD, incidences of CAD, hypertension, diabetes are actually increasing, with time gradually. So this is what secular trend. Okay. So for example, if I will just draw the graph that will serve the purpose over here. For example, some diseases are there which are actually decreasing with the decades, but some diseases are there which are actually increasing with the decades. For example, CKD, which are coming very frequently these days, CAD, okay, coronary artery disease, hypertension, diabetes mellitus, okay, they are actually coming very frequently now. Okay. On the other hand, if we talk about the plague, we talk about the smallpox, if we talk about the anthrax, these cases are actually fortunately gradually decreasing over the decades. Okay, so these are the secular trends. I mean, these are the long-term trends which we are seeing in the population. Okay, so that is the thing. Let's say here it is the 2022. Here we can say that it is the 1900. So over decades, some diseases are there which are actually increasing in the population. Some diseases are there which are actually decreasing over decades. Okay, so that is actually explained under the long-term trends. Fine. Now we shall move on to the one more important term, that is a place distribution. Okay, that's a place distribution. So let's talk about that as well. So if we talk about the place distribution, okay, place distribution, it simply tells that some diseases are there which could be found in the rural areas, some diseases could be there which can be found in the urban areas, right? So what diseases are there? For an example, okay, some diseases could be found in the rural areas, some diseases could be found in the rural areas. Okay, rural areas. Okay, what are those diseases? For an example, you might say, animal bite cases, okay, or the diarrhea cases, okay, or these kind of things. So animal bite or dog bite cases, for example, animal bite cases, right? Or you might say the fungal infection cases, right? Dermal infection cases, dermatitis, tinea infection, for example, right? So these kind of cases might be coming in the rural areas. On the other hand, if you talk about some diseases in the urban areas, some diseases might be found in the urban areas, also comparatively high in the urban areas. So what are those diseases? For an example, some diseases could be found in urban areas also, right? For an example, let me take the example over here. For example, in the urban areas, you are seeing very commonly hypertension, CKD, coronary artery disease, right, diabetes mellitus. Okay, all these things are actually more commonly found in the etc, right, etc. So all of these things might be, all of these diseases are actually comparatively more common in the urban areas due to the lifestyle and all of other factors, right? Okay, this is the place distribution. I mean, some people are living in urban areas or the rural areas. What are the diseases which can be found in these two areas? Okay, so that is the thing. Now moving on to the next point. Now that is the place distribution we have talked about. Now let's talk about the person distribution. Okay, so one more important entity that might be asked, that is a person distribution. Okay, what we are talking about right now, guys, person distribution in which epidemiology study? That is a descriptive epidemiology, right? Okay, so here in this particular case, in the person distribution, we are actually talking about several factors. For example, based on the age, or based on the gender, or based on the occupation, or based on the socioeconomic factors. Okay, so based on all these factors, what we can actually describe, okay, as far as diseases are concerned, right? For example, some diseases are there which you might comment upon the gender factor. Okay, according to the gender, these diseases are there very commonly in the males or females. According to the occupation, these diseases are more common, right? These kind of things. So that's a person distribution. So firstly, let's take the example of, first one, let's take the example of based on gender. Okay, so based on gender, what we can talk about? Based on gender, we can say that, you know, if the male is there, either the male could be there, either the female could be there. In the males, usually CAD cases, hypertension cases are coming very commonly. Okay, in the females, usually it is depression. Okay, depression cases, anxiety cases, right? Urinary tract infection. Okay, usually it is comparatively common in the females, right? That is based on the gender, right? Second, we can take the example of based on occupation also. For example, if some person is there, okay, who is working in the coal factory, or is a coal worker basically, so what could have been happened if I'm talking about, if he is a coal worker, okay, or he's a painter, okay, what could be seen? Is coal worker, and probably anthracosis, pneumoconiosis might happen, right? If he's a painter, plumbism might happen, right? Then if you talk about third one, that is, here you shall talk about based on age also. Like in children, there are some diseases which are very common. In adults, there are some diseases which are very common, right? So like that, we can say that in children or in adults. In adults, again, probably coronary artery disease, you are seeing that after 40 to 50 years. CKD, you are seeing that usually after 40 to 50 years. Okay, hypertension, diabetes also, right? Usually, okay, however, they might be seen in the pediatric age group also, children age group also, not the pediatric one as such, like less than 5 years, but in 15 years or in 20 years, I have seen the many cases of CKD at around 20-25 years as well. Okay, so this could be the cases. Prostate problems can be seen in the elderly age group, right? So that is the thing. In the children age group, you can say, for example, pneumonia can be there, pneumonia, respiratory infections, right? Then heart diseases, for example, ASD, VSD, all these kind of things, okay, you might be seen in the, on the basis of age distribution, we can say that in particularly in the children, they might be seen, right? Then based on the marital status, yes, based on the marital status, so what we can expect based on marital status, okay, it means marital status means either the person could be married or unmarried, for example, right? So let's say if the patient is married, okay, or if the person is married, okay, married person, happy or unhappy, right? There could be the mixed queries from you guys, right? So in the married section or in the unmarried section, right? So the married people, they might be having the depression sometimes, okay, sometimes I said in quotes, okay, there could be the depression, there could be in the females, there could be the chances of cervical cancer, right? And if you talk about the unmarried people, right, there are the risks for example, sexually transmitted infection, reproductive tract infection, okay, etc. So these kind of things can be seen basically. So like that, we shall talk about many factors over here as far as person distribution is concerned. So guys, in a nutshell, what we have talked about in the descriptive epidemiology, we have talked about the trends in the descriptive epidemiology. In the epidemiology, descriptive type of epidemiology, we have talked about that we are actually discussing the disease, we are discussing the population, we are discussing the disease by person, age and time, okay, and we were talking about the time trends basically, or the time fluctuations. We have talked about the short-term trends, periodic trends and the long-term trends. We have talked about further, the person distribution and the place distribution. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this section, and now I will be discussing some MCQs. Let's try to, whatever we have actually learned in this particular section, let's try to apply that in the MCQs as well. So if you will see this particular MCQ, okay, so let's try to discuss some MCQs as well over here. For example, first one, that is the changes in the occurrence of disease over a long period of time, right? So guys, change in disease over a long period of time. Which trend, guys? Long-term trend. Which trend I told you? Also known as secular trend. Secular trend. So over here the answer became secular trend. Very easy. Next one. Second one is a disease condition like influenza pandemic occurs every 10 years. Every 10 years. Which trend? Yes. Cyclical trend. Cyclical trend. Very nice. There is a cyclical trend. Okay. Cyclical trend. It is a type of which trend? Periodic trend. Which trend? Periodic trend. Okay, fine. Moving on to the next question. Accidents happening during weekends. Okay, the motorcyclists are there. Okay, they went on for a road. Okay, so what happened? Accident happened, for an example. So what could be the thing over here? Which trend I'm talking about? Cyclical trend. Cyclical trend. Okay, that is a cyclical trend or the weekend trend. Cyclical trend. Okay, it can't be seasonal. It is a cyclical trend. Okay, then food poisoning is an example of. Food poisoning, I told you, that was an example of, yes, SAPS, or is it MAPS? I mean the single exposure point source epidemic or the multiple exposure point source epidemic. Food poisoning, I told you, it is an example of single exposure point source epidemic. Example of single exposure point source epidemic. So that is your point source epidemic. Understood? Nice. Next question. In a case of epidemic, 3 villages are affected simultaneously with typhoid cases. Okay. Upon study, it is found that one milkman is going to all these 3 villages. You understood what they are talking about? I mean, which kind of exposure they are talking about over here? That is the single exposure, multiple exposure, or is it seasonal or something like that? It is a multiple exposure point source epidemic, right? So over here, what should be the answer? Multiple exposure point source epidemic. That is this one, common source multiple exposure, right? Sixth one, point source epidemic. Point source epidemic is there is sharp rise. There is sharp rise or gradual rise? Sharp rise in the number of cases. So over here, A and D has been ruled out. Look at the B option, sharp rise and sharp fall in the number of cases. Look at the C option, sharp rise and fall is interrupted by secondary waves. No, fall is interrupted by second waves. It means it is MAPS. It is MAPS. But sharp rise and sharp fall in the number of cases, that is SEPS. That is single exposure point source epidemic, right? Correct answer should be the B option. That is a sharp rise and sharp fall in the number of cases. That is the point source epidemic. That is a point source epidemic. Okay. So that was about the descriptive epidemiology, and I hope you enjoyed this section of descriptive epidemiology. In the next section, I will be trying to talk about the analytical epidemiology in the particular epidemiology section, right? So thank you so much for sparing your time with me in this particular section. I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much.